Hey there, welcome to Board Game Hot Takes, the podcast where we give our immediate reactions to the hottest board games just minutes after playing them. My name's Tim.
And this is Chris.
This is Adam.
Today we're going to talk about the game we just finished playing, Brian Boru, High King of Ireland.
AKA Brian Boru, High King of Ireland.
Uh-oh.
Sorry.
But before we give you a description of the game, I've got some poll results and a little bit of news to talk about. Just a couple quick things. Number one is that if you are in the Greater Phoenix metro region, I'm going to be at the AZ Game Fair, which is a bigger game convention around here, on Saturday, March 12th. If you're in the area, if you're planning to stop by that convention, look for me. I'll have my Board Game Hot Takes t-shirt on. Hit me up. Let's see if we can get a game in together.
Sounds like fun.
Anyway, I have some poll results. So this week on Twitter, I asked the question, what's the first thing that catches your eye about a game and makes you consider buying it? The options I gave were the designer, production of the game, the theme, or the mechanisms. And this question was actually given to me by Chris. I had a little bit of writer's block on writing polls this week, and Chris gave this to me, and it was a very popular poll. So thanks, Chris. How'd you guys answer this one?
For this one, I put mechanism, but really, it's all of the above. Just dependent. So like for this game tonight that we played, Brian Boru. Why is it so hard to say? I went for it because of the mechanisms. I like trick taking, I like drafting, I like area control, and I like Ireland. That's theme. It all kind of blended together. But in other cases, there's been games like Oath or John Company, where because they're Cole Wehrle games, and I'm such a big fan of Pax Pamir, and I feel like Cole Wehrle always has something different and unique to offer within his games, I'll take a look at whatever he's putting out there. So sometimes it's just by the designer.
Also because you're such a big fan of Root, right?
And then there's cases where the theme just captivates me. ISS Vanguard and the art. So it just depends on what's out there. It's not necessarily one thing. I don't know. So I'm all over the place on this one. What about you, Chris?
You know, this is a tough one. Even though I came up with the question, it was a pretty tough one to answer because there's really kind of two that go hand in hand for me. I definitely like a great production, and I think I have to give the nod to production over theme. Theme is the other one that I kind of toyed around with a little bit there because a really cool theme, I think, draws me right in and can get me interested in a game that otherwise I wouldn't be that interested in. I actually probably bought some bad games because the theme looked so cool. But the reality is, if a game has a great production, it might attract my attention just because it looks so nice. And of course, it has to meet other criteria. I mean, it has to be a good game and it has to have decent mechanisms and all the other things. But when it comes to what catches my eye immediately, I gotta tip the hat to great production. Tim, what did you say for this?
Yeah, this was really hard for me too, because when I asked for some options for a poll on Twitter and you sent this to me and I was like, man, I don't even know how I'm going to answer this. So I just put the poll out into the world and thought about it for a little while. I think I had to go with production on this, but maybe not in the way you guys think of. I was trying to think of like what games actually made me click into the BGG page and pay attention to it. And usually it's if somebody took a picture of the gameplay and I saw the board laying out and it just looked cool. And it doesn't have to be like big minis. It doesn't have to be anything specific about the production. But if I just see components out on a table, that's always the most exciting view for me. So I think that's usually when I've given a game a second look and actually decided to click in and learn more about it, is usually after seeing that. But I definitely don't buy a game unless the mechanisms seem amazing. So like, I definitely, once I look in and I look at the mechanisms, if I'm not sold on that, then I'm gone. Yeah, I think it was production for me as well. I'd have to say that. Sometimes the box cover, I guess that would be considered part of production. And so once in a while, that'll get me to click into something as well.
I'm honestly surprised by that answer, Tim. I would have thought you'd been mechanisms all the way.
Yeah, but I don't, the thing I was trying to figure out is like, where do you hear about mechanisms? And to be honest, even some of my favorite mechanisms, like I hear deck building, I like deck builders, but that doesn't get me excited, or I hear worker placement or whatever. And there's not a mechanism that I'm just like, I have to go check that game out because it's got a cool mechanism. It usually is seeing the game out there and then getting to know what the mechanisms are. That kind of the combination sells me on it. The one that surprised me was designer. It occurred to me that I don't think I'm in love with any particular board game designer. There's no one designer where every one of their games that I've played, I've been blown away by it. For the most part, every game that I love, the designers failed me on another design that they've done. So like there really aren't any designers where I see that name and I'm like, oh, I got to check that out now.
I agree with you on that one. There was a point where I'd be like, oh yeah, every game this gal makes, I'm going to take a look at it because I liked one of their other games. And then like, at some point it all kind of just falls flat. So it's not like an author where an author puts out a book and you're like, oh, I'm going to read this book because I really like this author's writing style, and it's very characteristic and very, you know a lot about what you're going to get with any book that author puts out. And I wouldn't say that's necessarily true about board games.
I agree. There were quite a few answers on this one. So as always, I'll mention that if you don't follow us on Twitter, you should. You can find us at BG_hot takes. There's a lot of conversation on this. So I'm not going to read all of them, but a couple stood out to me. This one was particularly poetic, I thought. So Little J Games said, I compare it to music. I'd rather listen to a song that has an appealing theme, melody, topic, even if the band doesn't play it especially well mechanically. But a song whose theme is unappealing is less interesting no matter how great the band's mechanics are. It's a pretty interesting take, basically saying the theme's got me driven. It's okay if it fails mechanically. I disagree on that. Personally, if a game doesn't play great, then I don't want to revisit it, even if the theme is really cool. But interesting take on it.
Yeah, I like the analogy there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian Chandler said, I'm starting to learn that I enjoy certain designers or design teams, so that's a go-to for me, which is kind of the opposite of what I was saying. But he says, that opposes my value of supporting new and non-white dude designers, many of whom don't have the big name yet of those already established. That's an interesting conundrum because we keep talking about wanting more diversity in games, but I think it's also hard because it's hard for people to break through and get published and maybe get the support to play to get their games play tested and get the feedback that they probably deserve. And so I think it is hard. Like there aren't necessarily as many exciting games by non-white male designers just because there aren't as many games out there in general. So it is that's a hard challenge.
One really interesting variation on that point. I know that some people actively seek out underrepresented designers. In fact, just today on Twitter, I was looking at a chain of tweets where Elizabeth Hargrave was talking about her website where she puts out lists of underrepresented groups, designers of color, LGBTQ designers, etc. And I know I've gone there many times to identify games that were designed by underrepresented designers and actively went for those. And I think some other people had responded more or less the same. So, that may not be going for one particular designer, but the designer does end up mattering to me in those situations.
That makes sense, Chris. What Brian was saying here, though, is that, when he's kind of fallen in love with a particular designer's games, then he tends to go back to it. And that's just kind of the opposite of what you're doing when you're going for a designer because they're underrepresented, which means you're not really pursuing the history that you've had with their designs. But yeah, that's a valuable reason to look into other games as well. I'm sure you can find and discover some surprises and some exciting new things that way as well.
Chris, I have a question for you. When Eric Lang releases a game, doesn't that make you perk up immediately? Aren't you going to investigate that? Or is that because it's part of the CMON games and it's going to have giant minis and a giant production and a very nice aesthetics? Or is it because it's Eric Lang and you really enjoy his game?
Like Tim, I've been disappointed by most designers at least one time in there. Of course, we have the game of which we will not speak.
Oh, yeah.
AKA Marvel United. But yeah, overall, I enjoy almost everything that Eric Lang does, and they also meet the other criteria that I love: a great production and big minis and all that stuff. Plus, he's just a great game designer. So yeah, I would pay attention if there's a designer that I know of and like and want to follow. I'll go after those games. Doesn't mean I'm going to like every single one of them, but it certainly can catch my attention.
Now, Dr. Wicks on here, who is one of the designers of Robotech Reconstruction,
Yeah.
which is a game that we reviewed several months back and had a chance to chat with him. But he said word of mouth. And he gave some examples. And I agree. I mean, for sure, if I've heard good things about a game, someone's like, yeah, I recommend this to you because you like these types of games. Or I hear a reviewer that I trust and they're like, this fits perfectly. Yeah, that's a great. When I asked the question, I think when Chris asked it, we were kind of more of like, hey, you get a first glimpse at it. What makes you sit there and take notice? So it was a little outside of the spirit of what I was asking there. But I would agree that that's generally the most likely thing to make me actually buy a game. Anyway, yeah, lots of other great stuff out here. So feel free to check out that thread. Lots of good conversation there. So the poll results, though, came in as that 16% said the designer pushed them to buy it. Only 14% said production, which I was really surprised by. And like I said, I'm not much of a production guy necessarily, but that definitely is what gets me to look at a game. If I see, a game laid on a table and it just looks fascinating, that's going to get me interested in checking out. 48% said theme, so almost everybody was like, yeah, if it's about something I care about or I'm interested in, then I'm going to go after it. And then 22% said mechanisms. Interesting results. All right, so let's move on to a description of Brian Boru, High King of Ireland.
Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, is a trick-taking and area control game in which 3 to 5 players repel Viking invasions, build up their renown through political maneuvering, arrange marriages of state, build churches, all those favorite pastimes of 11th century Ireland. So gameplay takes place over a series of 3 to 4 rounds, each of which starts with a card draft where players will select from a hand of action cards, choosing the most desirable and then passing the leftovers to the next player. When the draft phase is completed, the action moves to the game board, which contains a large stylized map of Ireland with villages represented by colored circles. The board also has a battle area, which will be filled each round with Viking raiders, a church area where players can invest in new monasteries, and a marriage track that will determine who will be the most eligible bachelor or bachelorette for a desirable marriage at round's end. The active player starts the round by selecting a city. The color of that city then becomes the active color for that turn. Each player throws down a card of any color they choose, but the player who takes the trick will be the player who played the highest card value in that suit. Regardless of who won or lost the trick, each player will get a chance to take an action from the card they played, and the winner will take the powerful primary action from the card, and the others will take a less powerful secondary action. Those actions will range from taking coins from the bank to killing Viking raiders to moving up the marriage track, and when enough tricks have been played to exhaust the player's action cards, the upkeep phase begins. Now during the upkeep phase, the players are going to resolve 4 different steps. First, the marriage step will reward the player highest on the marriage track with a desirable spouse who comes with a political alliance. When resolving the battle step, the players will determine whether they successfully stopped a Viking invasion, or if a few of the nasty little buggers got through. And then anybody who joins the fight will enjoy the spoils of the battle in the form of renown and other benefits. Next, the players will claim regions of the map based on their influence in each region. And finally, during the church step, players will turn their investments in the church into new monasteries, or at least a victory point or 2. When there are no marriage cards left at the end of the upkeep phase, the game is over and the player with the most points wins. Needless to say, this is just a brief summary, but hopefully this will give you enough information about the gameplay to follow our conversation if you're not familiar with the game. Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, was designed by Pierre Sylvester and is published by Osprey Games.
Thanks for that description, Chris. So what do you guys think of the gameplay and mechanisms of Brian Boru?
I hinted at it during the poll, but I love the mechanisms here. You start off with these cards, you do this draft, you're trying to consider what you're going to go after that specific round. You get to pick 2 out of however many cards are going around, depending on player count, and then you pass those to the left. I like that draft right away. That's pretty cool. Now, again, if you're not familiar with the game, you're not going to really know what's going on with the draft. So I think this was the first play for both of you. So how did that draft land for you guys?
It's such a simple draft. I mean, the cards are pretty simple, right? It's like the number in the top left and the color on it. And so mainly if you want to win regions, you draft the high number cards. If you want to go after the church that round, you draft the crosses at the bottom. If you want to go after the love track or whatever it's called, the marriage track, the love track.
Love doesn't factor into it.
If you go after the marriage track, you get the envelopes that are at the bottom. That's it. So I don't think it's that complicated. If anyone has just been taught the rules rudimentarily, is that even a word? Anyway, if anyone's been taught the rules, I think the draft's going to make perfect sense. So I think this is probably one of the easier drafts to get into that I've seen.
Now, Chris, what about you? You won the game, and Tim did not win the game. So I want to hear your take on the draft.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm with Tim on this one. I thought that it was super simple. The basics of this game are incredibly simple, and it's funny because the art of this and the iconography of this game and the mechanisms of these different tracks and these different areas that you're focusing on are so straightforward. It's like they're these big cartoon colored big icons. I mean, it's all so easy to follow, which is, I think, it's actually a really nice part about this game. But I thought that the draft fit right into that as well. You're looking at these cards and they're super simple. You've got 3 different choices, your primary action and usually 2 secondary actions on a card. And for each one, the iconography couldn't be clearer. You know exactly what you're doing. And the choices are simple enough. Like, if you get 2 envelopes, you're moving twice up that marriage track. If you get a couple of crosses, you are going to be putting some tokens into the church track. And I think that the draft factored into that as well and was equally simple, so I didn't think it was a problem.
I almost wonder even how important is the draft here? We drafted the first round, and Steve was just whining the whole round because I've got a handful of 20 plus point cards, and he's got a handful of like 1 through 6 cards. So even though he drafted, he still ended up with nothing. Didn't really change. So how important is the draft? I mean, like a traditional trick taker, if you just get dealt a hand of 8 cards, part of it is just about playing the cards at the right time. And this game even more so, because sometimes you just want to lose, the region. You want to take the lower number. So do you guys think that the draft was actually really an important part of this gameplay?
Well, that attitude is why you didn't win, Tim.
That's what I'm saying. That's the point I'm trying to make. I think the draft was super important here. I think sometimes you want to have those high cards and you want to protect yourself with those low cards. So if you don't want to win, you can play one of those low cards and you're safe. Or if you do want to go after something, you have that option to do it. So you want to give yourself options for the rest of the round. I think this whole game is filled with nuanced cleverness. To contrast it a little bit with Libertalia last week, Libertalia was, haha, I'm so clever. Look what I did here. Haha. But in this game, I felt like I would play a card and be like, I think I was clever. Did that work out? Yeah, it seems pretty. No, that wasn't clever at all. That didn't work out very well, did it? Or like, oh, wow, that just worked out pretty well. I feel pretty clever for doing that. I don't know why that worked out, but I feel pretty clever, I think. I think the draft is important here.
I agree. I think the draft was tremendously important. To the point about not getting good cards. I mean, good cards or whatever, meet your strategy. So we went through all these various rounds, and by the end, people were figuring out what is the 1 or 2 things that I'm trying to do that's going to move me up on the right tracks. And I had this thing completely gamed out. I had a very clear strategy, and I picked very specific cards because I thought they were going to get me up on the church track, or they were going to get me up on for example, the marriage track. I completely abandoned the marriage track because you guys are going for it, and I didn't want to waste my cards. I wanted to focus on other things. So I made sure not to draft those cards during the drafting period. And I imagine you guys were doing the same thing.
So Tim, what did you think? I feel like you don't think the draft was too consequential here.
I feel like the game would have played almost the same if we just been handed 7 cards, picked 6, or like in like Hearts, if you want to play an advanced variant, you take your 7 cards and then you pass 3 to the left of you, and that's it. I mean, which is kind of a draft, but a little quicker and simpler. Yeah, I'm not sure how much of it mattered, but I think you guys are probably right that to some extent, especially as you're getting later in the rounds and you're trying to fight. That last round, I definitely intentionally drafted cards that would get me up the marriage track. The previous round, I left myself on the marriage track. And intended to go after it. So, that gave me the opportunity to at least attempt that, and I might not have had that chance if we had done a draft. So it's probably good they do this. Otherwise, you could play a game and just get screwed every round with, not getting anything that works towards your strategy. So it's probably fine. But I think that the options are so simple, and because you get a benefit whether you win a trick or you lose a trick, it's not that impactful. I don't know if you could have blocked me from doing one particular thing, Adam, in a game, but maybe. No, it did really feel like a trick-taking game to me when you kind of pull back and take a look at the game, as to how it felt. It really was just a trick-taking game. It had a lot of interesting nuances. It was more complex than a traditional trick-taker, but everything you're doing, if you win a trick, you get a region. So it's an area control point that you got. If you lose a trick, you're usually getting movement up one of these other tracks. But it felt just like more like a more complex trick taker to me. And so which I liked. I thought that was pretty cool, and I like the decision of trick taking and the kind of like, hey, this round, I think I can suss out that he doesn't have any more blue cards. So if I play a low one, I can win it and get some better benefits. I like the decision making in trick taking and how sometimes you can screw yourself because you thought that everybody was out of cards, but they weren't. Somebody had a white card in there, which was a wild, and they managed to take that city from you that you were committed to. To me, it did really feel like a trick taker, and I like that part about it.
I'm kind of conflicted on this one. It's not a traditional taker like spades or hearts where you have to follow suit. It's one of these blended ones like shamans, or there's a few others that are doing it. So I don't know. It's a little weird. It's almost like a hand management situation and assessing what's in your hand versus what's out there versus what you think you might be able to get. So it's a little different thought process to me than a traditional trick taker where you have to follow suit and there's potentially a trump suit. So I don't know. It's different.
Yeah, I agree with Adam on that one. And just comparing it to Shamans, which is another trick-taking game that we've all played recently. If you're not playing the highest card or the lowest card in Shamans, the card that you play almost doesn't matter. I mean, you're ditching stuff out of your hand. In this game, every card you played mattered because whether you won the trick or not, you were going to be taking some action based on that. And probably more often than not, you were planning on taking the non winning action. So obviously, trick taking was a big part of it, but I thought that it was much more impactful, with the cards you were playing rather than whether you won the trick or not.
No, as far as the rewards that you get for winning a trick, which is going to be control of an area, and then if you lose a trick, usually the rewards are either going to be you're going to get money, you're going to get up the marriage track, you're going to fight Vikings, or you're going to be on the church track basically. What do you guys think of those choices? Did you enjoy that? Those little mini puzzles that were happening.
I did, yeah. I like the kind of evaluation and checking the board game state of seeing what you might possibly get this round or what that's going to set up for you in the upcoming rounds. I like that little mini game and deciding which colors to keep, knowing what you might be able to get. There's a lot going on. It seems like simple decisions, but you have these 3-4 regions going around the board during the upkeep phase, which all kind of tie into this kind of a mixture of decisions and nebulous effects of what's going on. So I enjoyed it. I like these little puzzles. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I like them as well. I think the one that I found the most interesting was the area control, which probably is more than a mini game in this, but there's the little mini games, but then there's the macro game of the area control. And I thought that one was pretty interesting, particularly because your area control is really area majority. So there may be a region with 4 cities, and in order to get the points for that region, there has to be a certain number of cities owned. So for example, in a 4-city region, you might have had to have somebody controlling 2 of those cities or 3 of those cities. The points for that region go to the player who has the majority in that region. And I thought that was really interesting. I enjoyed that. I liked the fact that there was no fighting in this game. It was really just about positioning your tokens in the right place. And then there's also the opportunity to drop those Viking tokens on top of somebody else's city, which essentially takes it away from them and gives it to the Vikings, which is kind of a take that, which is really satisfying at some points. What did you guys think about that?
Well, it was cool that some of the mini games impacted the area control, impacted the board. Both
Exactly.
the churches kind of reinforced one of your areas, and the Vikings maybe potentially negatively impact the other areas. But the Vikings didn't have to do that, especially if all the Vikings were defeated. What was cool about the Vikings is that they just gave you escalating points depending on how often you were going out there and attacking them. And, it was pretty neat that it interacted a little bit, and even the marriage track did. In most of the rounds, when you won the marriage at the end, usually they would give you a control token in an area, or they would give you some other benefit related to the area control. So it's kind of neat that those were separate games, but they, separate little like things you're fighting for, but they all did have some impact on the main puzzle that was going on there. It really felt tied in. Like, to contrast that, I played a game of Trajan by Stefan Feld a couple weeks ago. And the most unsatisfying thing about that game is that it uses a completely different mechanism set. It uses a rondel to determine how you're competing in these different regions. And there is an area control map at the top that you're competing in if you take a certain action on the rondel, but in another action you do something else. And the most frustrating thing about that is that a couple of the regions had 0 interaction. It's like you would do that action and it just did that thing, and it didn't impact anything else that was going on the board. So it felt like disparate puzzles, and in this case it felt like it all tied together in a pretty tight package. So I think the designer did a pretty cool thing with this, like the simple decisions and teaching the game super simple but pretty challenging decisions and complex decisions. A lot of interesting interactions happening there.
Yeah, so to kind of summarize, the area majority is the big game, and all these little separate mini games on the periphery are fun and tie in to that bigger game and what you're competing for, which is area majority over the territories of Ireland. And I think that's just a nice how they all echo back into that main plot.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So did you guys have any other mechanisms you want to mention?
Yeah, I have one that I want to dig into, and I think it was probably the biggest weakness of this game. What did you guys think of the upkeep phase?
I thought it was great. I thought it was interesting because you got to see the resolution of everything that's happening. And I feel like it's going to go pretty quick, once you kind of know how everything triggers. So that's where the puzzle came together. What's your problem with it, Chris?
I felt like this is the one place where you took a game that was otherwise very straightforward, and it just introduced these odd little bits of complexity that ended up being quite confusing. I think probably the best example is the church track. If you had the highest number of tokens in the church track, then you get one benefit. And then you take all your tokens out, but then the next highest people get a point, but then they have to take certain numbers of tokens out depending on what they did. And then if they have a certain number of tokens left after that, then you get a monastery, which is the same benefit that the person who won got, but they had to take all their tokens out, and you only have to take certain number of tokens. It got so confusing that by the end, Adam had to like walk us, handhold us through that phase every time. And it felt like this situation where every round we were going through these straightforward actions and then going through this like little mind-bending upkeep phase at the end of each round.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'll let Adam speak here in a second. But I was going to say, I actually was going to tie that into the user experience. And that was the big failure here, because they had some like reminders on the board that were supposed to show you what those things did. But even with Adam walking me through it, I couldn't follow what the iconography was trying to say on the board. If you simplified it too much, then it wouldn't be very interesting at all. But you're right. They might have left it a little bit too, complicated or quirky to resolve those things than it needed to be. What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, after doing it a few times, it starts to make sense, but it's still, for me, even I have to go back and be like,
Yeah.
What does this symbol mean again? What are we doing here? Okay, yeah, I get it. Okay, so this guy with the up arrow, it means discard all the tokens if you're in first place. So it takes a second to register. I mean, essentially, the Viking one and the church one are very similar in the way they resolve. But again, it's not, the icons there aren't totally straightforward. There should be a better way to make that happen.
Yeah, it's like if the winner of the Vikings, they're going to get to set a Viking token on a board, except that if the last place person is tied with someone else, they get multiples. But if it's multiple winners, then the last place person gets to pick where the Viking token goes. So it is depending on tiebreakers and stuff like that, it's got a lot of really weird things that are going on. So that's a good.
The ties are weird, and that's kind of a trademark of Peter Sylvester, especially in The King is Dead. It's very much of a get ready for the tiebreak. Here's what's going to happen in the tiebreak. So you have to plan for that.
There were a lot of ties.
All right, well, let's talk about the theme and production here. I have to say that when I sat down and was looking at the board and even the cards, the iconography on it, the production is very boring to me. So I didn't find anything particularly cool about the production, other than I think playing with those little rings to put around your tokens on the board is a nice way to represent control or an increase in something without covering the token or having to swap it out or anything like that. So that was kind of a cool little piece. But what did you guys think of the production?
The production here, I don't mind it. It's nothing flashy, nothing too blingy. It has a very classic kind of production to it with wood tokens. But I've heard mixed things about the art. And I like it. I really like the art. It kind of has that Inish feel to it. Kind of old school cards, but they take up, there's no white borders, Tim, so that's kind of nice. And the cards are tarot size, so they're huge in your hand. I do like the wooden discs that are out there. So from the physical standpoint, I like it. It is nothing flashy. I like the territory squares too. Those are thick, chunky chunks that you get to hold on to once you have the majority in a territory. So those are the good things. The bad things, the colors are blendy. The cities, the villages out there on Ireland, they're very similar to some of the tokens that the players are. Very similar colors. The active player marker is a red ring. So that was brought up, red ring and on an orange. Oh shoot, is it a Viking or is it just the orange one? So just some color mismatch and cleanup would be nice to see here. But I don't know. Other than that, I really, really like the art on the map. And it's very subdued, I would say. But for some reason, I really, really enjoy it. Chris, what are your thoughts here?
So first, how can anybody these days make another game about old Europe without it like being ironic? The theme is just not catching me. But that said, the production was not terrible. I think I agree with most of what Adam said. I feel like this is a game that doubles down on having a very basic, very abstract production to it. And in a way that works. I was saying before about the simple iconography, the big, bold colors. I think all of that makes for an appealing board. It doesn't make for a very interesting board, but it makes for a relatively appealing, easy to play board. And I think that there's a bit of a trade-off there. Sulkin, for example, I love the art in Sulkin. I thought it was so interesting, but when I look at that board, it's so confusing. There's so many things happening, and there's so many little bits of art here and there. I just played that with my family for the first time this last week, and the first thing my wife said was, "Oh my God, I can't play this. I can't even tell what the spaces are." In this game, I think the art gets out of the way and leaves space for, some clear decisions to be made. I don't think it necessarily helps the game, but I don't think it hurt it either. I think it's pretty neutral.
Yeah, I think the big iconography and the clean map makes a better user experience. But as Adam already mentioned, then it loses some of that with the color issues, and of course the iconography trying to explain what happens during the upkeep phase is a mess. So it's kind of a mixed bag here for user experience. But otherwise, I think you're right. The mechanisms are relatively simple, and so it's good that they didn't overcomplicate things and make it into a challenging user interface to do your main actions, your main turns. It's pretty quick choices. The hard part comes with the toughness of the choice, not with trying to determine what does this card do and how is it going to interact with the board and things like that. So I agree with that.
Let me just pitch in one more thing on that, because we've said a lot about iconography and clear or not. For me, there's a very clear mark of distinction between the card and general gameplay iconography, which I thought was incredibly clear, versus the upkeep phase iconography, which I thought was incredibly unclear.
Yeah, agreed.
Good point. Another thing I want to mention on the physical map, the villages do have this kind of glossy coat of paint on them that make them glint a little bit off the light and make them stand out a little bit against the subdued map. So that helps somewhat with the coloration issues. And it does have a little raised up thing too. So that's just kind of nice to touch and feel around too.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's jump into our final question and final thoughts. And would you request to play this game again? And Chris, why don't you start?
I don't think I would. I had fun playing this game. I enjoyed it. I didn't dislike it at all. But I feel like... So a couple things. The gameplay was relatively simple. And then you get to the upkeep phase, and then it's a little too complicated. And it never seems to get to the right mix of those two, I think. But at the same time, it's not so out of balance that I found it unpleasant to play. So I did find it pleasant to play. It always felt to me like a little bit of a fits and starts. Like, this all smooth, 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 smooth. Then we're going to do a couple clunky things. And then we're going to come back and it's going to be smooth, smooth, smooth. A couple more clunky things. That to me sort of took me out of the game and reduced my enjoyment a little bit. Certainly, if you guys wanted to play it, I would be happy to. I would not say no to a game of this, but I don't think I'd be asking for it again.
Tim, I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, first of all, I loved the trick-taking mechanism and tying that into a heavier game because I like trick-taking, and I thought that was awesome. I thought it was really fun. The decisions were great every time. I didn't mind the draft. I'm not sure how important it was, but I like drafting generally, so that was a fun, quick decision you could make. And I liked how the trick-taking combined with all these little mini games that also had some interactions together. So that was all great. I just wish this mechanism was put on any game that didn't have area control in it, because I don't like area control. And so for that reason, I'm not going to ask to play the game again. I mean, it's typical for me, like first 2 rounds of the game, I made all the right decisions and I got myself set up. And then, of course, everyone says, well, Tim's leading now. Let's tear him down. Let's all go after and stop Tim from what he's trying to do the rest of the game. And that annoys the crap out of me. I hate playing games where people are directly going after you because you're succeeding, because you've done something well. So the best thing to do in this game is like stay back. Don't do your best early. Let other people fight it out and then come from behind. It's not this game. It's just area control games in general. That was not a fun experience for me, and that generally is not a fun experience for me. But this had a lot of fun mechanisms together. I would be happy to play this with you guys again, but I don't think I'd ask for it just for that reason. But man, do I want somebody to take this same exact mechanism set and stick it on some other kind of Euro game where when you lose the trick, you get X resource, but if you win the trick, then you get to move up this track that gets you a better benefit. Give me like a real Euro game with this mechanism in it, and I would love to play that game. But it was fun. It was a fun experience. There was a lot of cool big moments, surprises when the tricks turned over. Oh, Steve just won that with a 4 because nobody else saved a yellow, or they didn't want that area. They wanted the benefit that they were going for. So cool moments in the game, but just not my type of game, I think. Adam, what do you think?
I think the area majority is freaking awesome here in this game, Tim. That's one of my favorite parts. The mechanisms here, the draft, the dry theme, I don't know, the discs, the way it's designed. I love it all. I don't know why. It does have some little fiddly stuff, and it does have some nuances that are just kind of head scratchers. But for whatever reason, this game kind of calls to me, and I enjoy it. I enjoy the art and the big old tarot cards and the miscolored discs, and it's just fun. All the mechanisms seem to work. I like that reset phase where it's almost like 3 or 4 little separate, smaller Dune Imperium battles that are resolving at the end of each round, if you think about it. So, you got the marriage track, that's kind of like a battle. You got the Viking tokens, it's another like kind of auction. How much are you going to bid? You've got the church track. How many guys did you bid to put in that church track during the course of the game? And then it goes down, and each of those might affect the territory control that you resolve finally. I like it. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of nuance there. At least I hope there's a lot of nuance there yet to discover. At this point, the game still seems very kind of nebulous to me, and I want to uncover more of its secrets, hopefully, that are actually there to uncover.
Yeah, so a couple things. One is that the game is a really short length. I mean, like an hour play, maybe even less than that once you get going with it, and that's great. That lends itself to, even if you're frustrated because of the negative experiences that can come out of it, it's going to be over quickly. And there's a lot of fun decisions and activity that happens there. So I applaud it for that. One thing I wanted to mention that you just reminded me of as you were talking about the overall game is the fun decision that you can move up on one of those tracks. And in certain situations, if you don't win it, you get to leave your tokens there. So you can set yourself up for next round's marriage track or next round's Viking win or next round's church track. And I like that. I thought that was cool. It's not a all or nothing type of situation where you're racing for these things and you either get the big benefit or you get nothing. It's like I get the big benefit or I get a little benefit and I'm sticking around for next round. I can set myself up for next round. So that was another cool part that I meant to mention when we were talking about mechanisms.
I want to go back to what I said at the beginning is I think this game has that nuanced cleverness, at least I hope it does, that's kind of opposite of something like Libertalia, where you're just like, haha, and that's kind of an in-your-face thing in Libertalia, whereas this one's like, I'm going to subtly do this and think ahead to next round and I can get this round. I kind of like that feeling in a game, and I hope it's actually there.
Yeah, I think it is. And even in the trick-taking decisions, it leads to those situations where if you're planning it out right and you're thinking about it and like, okay, well, we've already fought over 3 yellow areas and people put all their high cards down. So if I save this yellow card, I might be able to get an area and a bunch of benefits for a cheaper card. So I think there's a lot of nuance here. And I also think that this is a game that if you like area majority and you like that kind of combat mechanism, it's never going to get stale because you're playing the other players and you're playing the decisions that they're making and stuff like that. So if you like what it's doing here, I think you're going to like it for a long time. And it's not something you can solve. It's not a puzzle you can solve because you're solving the puzzle against other players and the choices they're making, which is what's great about trick taking. It's why I can play Hearts a billion times in a row and still have fun with it, even though it's the simplest of simple games. I think this succeeds on a lot of areas. And if it weren't for my distaste for, that area control or area majority situation and that being such a main part of it, I think this would have been a huge hit. So yeah, all right, cool. And I actually would like to see you bring this, Adam, to PDXCon. I think it, even though I said I wasn't going to ask for it again, I kind of want to play it again. I want to try it one more time at least. I think it's a fun game that you can get knocked out quickly and it's got some fun moments and fun interactions. So I think it's got a lot going for it.
It deserves another play for sure.
All right, cool. Well, I think that'll wrap up our conversation on Brian Boru, High King of Ireland. We've got a Brian Boru themed cocktail as well as some games on our table right after this. All right, welcome back. So, Chris, what do you have for us this week?
So, cocktail may be a little bit of an overstatement this week, but I think it's a fun drink anyway. So, a few episodes ago, we were talking about Brass Birmingham, and we talked about the proud history of English drinking. So, like England, Ireland also has a long, proud liquid history, but unfortunately, most people just aren't aware of how deep Ireland's bench of drinks really is. So, Irish whiskey is great for sure. Beyond that, though, the first thing that comes to mind for most folks is green beer on St. Patrick's Day, which is highly unsatisfactory in my opinion, with the one notable exception of Guinness. It's an awesome stout that's also one of the great classics. But, I always ask, how can we liven that delicious drink up even more? And it turns out there's a long tradition of mixing Guinness with other types of drinks, lagers, ales, champagne, etc. And that makes a great drink even better. Now, since moving to Portland, I've come to learn that Portlanders really love their cider, and I do too. So it makes perfect sense that for a game of Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, I'd raise a Black Velvet, which is a wonderful drink made of Guinness and cider. The ingredients, It couldn't be any simpler. You get a can of Guinness and a bottle of dry hard cider. The measurements are simple too. It's a 50-50 mix, but you can mix it in any variations you want, just whatever your taste is. And if you want to add a little fun to your beverage, you can float the Guinness on top of the cider. So you fill your pint glass halfway with the cider, then you put a spoon just over the top, and you pour very gently. And then this should cause the lighter Guinness to float on top of the cider rather than mixing together. It's a pretty cool look and a fun way to impress your fellow gamers. I've tried that. I have not had a lot of success with it, but I've seen the pictures online and people have been much better at that than I am. And it does look really cool and it's a lot of fun. Now, for the purists, I will say I've seen a couple drinks that are called the Black Velvet. One that I see more commonly is Guinness and champagne, basically the same mixture. Guinness, 50% Guinness and 50% champagne, called the Black Velvet. I've also heard the one with cider called the Poor Man's Black Velvet. But the reality is, I love cider, so that's why I went with this one. And I think it's a nice drink and easy to do and goes down very smooth.
This is one cocktail I did not mess up tonight. But I did want to mention, Chris, it's funny that you just mentioned the champagne mixture because the first time I ever had a Black Velvet was with champagne and Guinness. So I assumed it was a different drink, but it sounds like it's got the same roots. But yeah, I sat down at a champagne bar, I guess that's a thing. And that was the most interesting drink on the menu, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. And this reminded me of that. So
there's like a list. There's the Black Velvet. There's the Black and Tan.
Have you ever had a snake bite?
A snake bite. I love a snake bite. That's like harp and cider, right?
Yeah, well, there's so many variations of this in London, not necessarily north of London because I'm a world traveler. They had this thing called a snake bite, and I think it was some sort of dark ale with a cider, and then they'd mix in some black currant in there too, which would make it up this red color. It was delicious. It's one of my favorite drinks, Chris, so I'm disappointed to get to join in with you guys tonight.
Nice, I like that. Well, there you can put almost anything. I think I saw one, it was called like the Poor White Trash or something like that, and it was Guinness mixed with Bud Light, which, I don't judge anybody's beer, but I just thought that was kind of funny.
very cool. All right, well, let's talk about some games that we've been playing lately. Chris, what have you had on your table this week?
I got an opportunity for the first time to play my new expansion, Arts and Architecture for Tapestry. Now, Tapestry is one of my all-time favorite games. I absolutely love it. It's a game that we actually get to the table pretty frequently in our house because everybody loves this game. I've never played Tapestry with anybody who doesn't like it other than
Adam.
Adam, I think, is the only person I've ever met that doesn't like Tapestry.
This game's pretty mediocre, guys.
Well, anyway, we're going to ignore that. Arts and Architecture expansion does exactly what an expansion ought to do. If you play Tapestry enough, it starts to get just a little bit samey. Now, it's not too bad because what I find is that I play a few games, a couple days in a row, put the game out on the table, and you don't want to put it away because it takes a long time to set up, so you maybe play it a couple nights in a row. And then by the end of that, I'm going, okay, I'm ready to move on to something else. But then I come back a month later or a couple of weeks later, and I'm so ready to jump back into the game and get back to those interesting decisions. But play it too much, it gets a little bit dry. So what the Arts and Architecture expansion does is it adds a new track that you can travel along. Now, I won't get deeply into the mechanisms here because we've done an episode on this, and I would invite anybody who's interested to go back and listen to it. But the basic gist of the game is that you are moving each turn up one advancement track. It could be military or science or technology. This adds an Arts and Architecture track, which provides an opportunity to do new actions. It provides an opportunity to get new cards or masterpiece cards, and they let you switch out some of your scoring opportunities, and they provide cards that are confusing the two probably, but I think it's the masterpiece cards where they are similar to the technology cards where you buy them and then they provide you some benefit when you buy them, but they also add an opportunity to increase your end of round income, which is huge because in this game, your income means so much to you because it's going to determine whether or not you're able to do one thing on your next round or two things or 10 things. And so this really created an interesting set of opportunities there. And it just adds a new element to the game. It adds some new buildings. It adds a new track. It's instead of 4, you have 5. I think that adds a whole bunch of new interesting decisions. Now, ironically, when we played, I did not go up the Arts and Architecture track. Everybody else kind of did. And man, did I pay the price. I actually scored less than 100 points.
Oh,
I mean,
jeez,
I didn't even know
Chris.
that was possible to score less than 100 points, but I did. And I think that's,
It's possible to score less than 100 points, Chris. It's definitely possible.
I didn't lean into the new material well enough. And, I don't know what that was, but I blew it. But I could see everybody else was having great fun with that arts and architecture track. And I want to get it back out so I can try it again now.
So, Chris, did you play with any of the new Capital City mats?
Yes.
What did you think of those?
Thank you for reminding me about that. That's actually a really,
They seem a little bit. They seem very unique compared to the original Capital City maps.
they are. The Capital City maps for the base game, for those who have played that before, who not played that before, it basically gives you grids of 9 squares that have some spaces blocked off as unbuildable. And so you're trying to build around those. And every time you filled up one of those 9 square grids, then you get an opportunity to get a resource, which is incredibly valuable in this game. And then your entire city card is made up of 9 of those 3x3 grids. What the new expansion does is it creates these asymmetric types of boards where, like mine, for example, was a swamp board and it had these lily pads on it. The lily pads were considered built upon for the purposes of scoring when you get when you get a resource. So the lily pad counts as a building, but you can build over it. And at the end of the game, if you haven't built over your lily pads, then you're going to lose a point for each lily pad. So there's a really interesting push and pull there between I want to work around these because I want the benefit of not having to put down as many buildings to get the free resource. But at the same time, I don't want to get docked the 10, 15 points or whatever it is at the end of the game for not having built over those lily pads. There was another one which I found particularly exciting. I actually wish I had played this one, but somebody else did. It was called the Mesa. It had this huge open space. Like one of the frustrations for anybody who's played this game before is building around these little stupid dots that fill in some of the spots. The Mesa is almost completely open, but the trick is you can't build off the side of it, which of course thematically is perfectly appropriate because you can't build off the side of a mesa. You really have to focus on building in these huge open spaces. And if you can do that, then there's crazy points to be had, but you're limited because you can't go off the board. So if you don't leave yourself the right spaces, then there's not much you can do with them. So that adds another interesting element as well. One other thing that I had forgotten to mention that I'll add here too is it adds a couple of slightly different mechanisms on the technology cards. There are technology cards here where you have to put a building on them in order to promote them, which can be another interesting choice because a lot of times you want to take those buildings, you want to put them out on your city board for all the reasons we were just talking about. But this gives you another alternative, which is to put them on the technology in order to promote that technology. The gist of what I'm saying here is that it doesn't change anything dramatically, but it changes a few things in interesting, clever ways. It adds new content and opportunities and alternatives that weren't in the base game. And I think that it does, for that reason, just what an expansion ought to do.
Yeah, the thing I'm most excited about, I think, is those masterpiece cards that gives you new income opportunities. So that seems really fun. But yeah, I'm really excited to play with this. I have the expansion. I haven't had a chance to play it with it yet. Is this one that you think you would always play with going forward? Like kind of like you do with the Plans Employees expansion, just always mix it in? Or do you feel like this is one where you're going to choose sometimes to say, let's leave out those extra pieces?
I think I would probably choose to play with it most of the time. I think that for the sake of ease, if I was teaching it to a new person, I would probably break out the base game. But if someone has played it once or twice, I think I'd break out the arts and architecture expansion as well. You said you haven't tried it yet?
I haven't yet. No, I do have it. Lots of other games on my table recently, but I'm very excited to give Tapestry a try, which is also one of my favorite games. And this seems like it had some really cool stuff, so I'm looking forward to playing it. I hope we get to play it in Portland at the end of April.
Yeah, if Adam doesn't have something else to say about it.
I will happily take my whooping in Tapestry with you guys. Always have a good time with this one.
So what about you guys? What's been on the table?
I have a game that I've been excited to play. My daughter has recently become very excited about playing this game. So let me describe it to you and we'll see if you guys can figure it out. Initially, each player starts with 12 warriors or pawns, here represented as circular discs. It's a bit of area control. It's played on a grid, an 8x8 grid. You can only move diagonally forward at first. And the goal here is you want to be able to jump your opponent's piece. But to do that, you have to be adjacent to them, diagonally adjacent. There has to be empty space behind them to jump to. So you're going through this, but you're just taking turns back and forth. This game has player elimination, so maybe nobody likes it, but I think it's cool. And if you make it all the way to the other side of the board, your warrior, your knight, your pawn, whatever he is, he becomes a king. And you get to yell "King me" at the other player. So anyway, any guesses as to what this game is so far?
This sounds kind of abstract, so I'm thinking it's probably a Reiner Knizia, right?
It could be. It could be. There's a lot of decisions going on here.
Checkers, obviously.
You got it, Tim. It's checkers. Just for fun, I looked it up on Board Game Geek. It says it was originally published in 1150. No designer credited, but there are 2 artists credited, Frank Hampson and Beatrix Potter. So I just want to dig into the story there, why there's artists credited for checkers. Anyway, this game was fantastic. My daughter is super excited about playing it with me. It's fun. It's so fun to watch her little brain work and see what she can do with just these kind of decisions that are going on in checkers. And so I'll tell you the story of the game we were playing. We were maneuvering. It was getting tense. We were both down to, I think we each had 3 kings, and I had like 2 or 3 regular guys, and she had 2 or 3 regular guys out there. And she trapped me. I had no choice but to move my king to the spot. She did a triple jump, boom, boom, boom. I had like 2 regular checkers left, and at that point I had to resign. She took the game. It was fantastic. That's checkers. That's what's been on my table lately. Do you guys have any questions about this game? Does the rules make sense?
How's the production on this?
The art.
There's so many productions. People are blinging this out left and right. You can go nuts on checkers, but we just got a little wood. It's nice, tactile, clickety clack.
My daughter has played this a little bit, mainly where there was a Italian restaurant right down the street from where I used to live, and they used to have it in like the waiting area. So if you're waiting for a table, you'd sit down, and she was always excited to play a game. We'd get halfway through, and then our table would get called. So I don't know the last time I've completed a game of checkers,
right.
But glad you're having fun with it.
What's been on your table, Tim?
Yeah, so I got a chance to play a few games now of Now or Never by Ryan Lockett and Red Raven Games. Now or Never is the sequel. It's the 3rd in the series of his kind of adventure book story style games, which started with Above and Below, and then Near or Far, and Now or Never is the 3rd in the series. I never played Above and Below, so I can't really speak to that one, but I have played Near and Far and really liked Near and Far. And what I like about it is that it has some fairly standard Euro type mechanisms. You're collecting resources, you're filling orders. It's got a little bit of a race piece to it, a little bit of worker placement. But the cool thing is that there are certain actions that in order to get some types of resources in the game, you have to go to these actions, and essentially you're journeying out into the wild and you're discovering this location, and somebody reads from the book a little bit of a story segment, and then you have to make a decision on it. But you don't know what the reward is that you're going to get for that segment, but you might have a general idea. So once you make your choice and you kind of roll for initiative on that based on some of the, how you built up your characters and stuff like that, is how successful you're going to be, then you're going to get some rewards. And so it's a Euro game with a little bit of randomness as to how you collect your resources and when you can get them. But it adds such a cool theme in that you're going out there and getting this story told to you, and as you're moving around this map, you're discovering new locations, and these characters that you're meeting, you might interact with them later on the map or on a future map. So I love that game, and I really enjoyed playing through the campaign of that. Steve and I played through a whole campaign one weekend, 12 games, and I had a blast with it. So when I heard Now or Never was coming out, which is the follow-up to that, I was pretty excited. I pre-ordered it, and I just got it in a couple weeks ago. Now I've had a chance to play it I think 3 or 4 times solo now, but then I had a chance. My brother was in town, Steve, who you may know from the show, but he was in town this last weekend, and my parents were in town as well, so we played a ton of games. But when they went to bed at night, him and I would bust out kind of a heavier Euro game, something that they didn't want to get involved in, and this was one of the games we picked. So I got a chance to play a 2-player game of this. Now or Never is very similar to Near or Far in that it is a mid to heavyweight, kind of resource management and Euro style game with a lot of story and a lot of theme in it, but it's very different gameplay. It doesn't play anything at all like Near or Far. The main mechanism of this game is that you are trying to help rebuild a city. And so you've got this empty grid. I think it's like a 5x4 grid where you're going to end up putting buildings on this grid. But to put buildings out there, you've got this set of buildings that are laid out randomly in a 5x4 grid over to the side of that board. And so as you build buildings, then you would take one of the buildings from the outside of that grid on the left and put it on your mat. It has to be on the bottom row of the mat. And then the next time you build a building, it has to be one of the ones that's adjacent to an empty space that was on the grid you pulled from. So you have a little bit of a spatial puzzle in that you both have to think about the map, the group of buildings you're pulling from, and what order you're going to be able to get to them. Because once you pull one off the side, you only have access to 3 on the next turn, and that's going to expand as you take more and more buildings out of there. But then as you put it on your map, you can only build either on the lower level or you can build above that. And there's like some costs on certain spaces where you build and things like that. So that's a lot of what the game is. You build by spending money, but then the way you get money primarily in this game is that there are 4 types of resources you're going to collect, and you trade those resources in different set combinations to get money. So you want to collect certain resources because the more you get of a certain type, or if you get 1 of each, you can trade it in for 12 coins. If you get 2 of these demon in a bottle and 2, I forget what the other one is, but there's the crystals, then you're going to get 14 coins. So depending on the combination of resources you can trade in, you're going to get stuff. And that's all cool. It's a fun puzzle. It's a fun game, fun set of mechanisms that are happening here. But what is the best about it, and same thing I liked about Near or Far, is that there's this big map in the middle of the board. And out on the board, there are these monsters. So aside from building your city up, you're trying to recruit citizens to come and live in your city. And mainly the way you're going to find citizens is you're going to rescue them from monsters. So if you want to get a citizen to come into your city, you have to go have an encounter with the monster. But in order to do that successfully, you have to equip your character. So these little equipment things that you can add and kind of give it asymmetric powers and make it more powerful. Really cool combat mechanism in this game regarding where you roll a 4-sided die. Depending whether you roll 1, 2, 3, or 4, that's which of the abilities you're going to trigger on your turn. And so you're trying to upgrade all of these abilities over the course of the game to make them stronger. But it's fun, exciting moments as you're rolling these dice. And then as you go out on the board, you will go to certain locations and read out of the storybook, and you'll get a little story segment that tells you who did you just encounter, here's the choice you have to make, and it may determine whether you're going to get good or bad reputation, whether you're going to rescue citizens, whether you're going to get more money or some of these resources that you find out there. Really thematic, really fun experience for me. Heavy. This is much heavier, I think, even than Near or Far, so it's quite a kind of a heavy, thinky, long game. Steve and I probably played the 2-player game with the teach, and it probably took us like 2.5 hours to get through it. So it's not a quick game. It's not a light game. I had a blast playing it. There's some elements of randomness for sure. I don't care. The story more than makes up for playing just a tight competitive game. In fact, Steve killed me because he was so focused on building his little city and his economy and getting the right resources. And I was just like, I want to go quest. I want to go on this mission over here. I want to go, encounter this monster over here, which theoretically could have helped me, but I was just having a blast walking around and experiencing this world. And yeah, this game is kind of why I like gaming. It's a game that gives me an experience, but also a challenging puzzle. So I can have the fun of doing this thing, but also get some story out of it and have an experience that feels, I don't know, like I'm accomplishing something, and that I'm learning something, and I'm getting a story told. It's the farthest thing from abstract you can imagine. In fact, the biggest complaint I would have about it is that, as Ryan Lockett tends to do with his games, and Empires of the Void 2 is a great example, Adam, we and I have talked about this before, is that there's a lot of little edge cases, little rules. In fact, there's like a whole stack of components that only come into the game if you get to the far left space on the board and happen to do this thing. So in the game that Steve and I played, we never even interacted with them, but I had to pull them out of a baggie and put them out on the board. And it's references to it on the player aids, and there's references to it in the rule book, but we never even ran into it. But the fact that if you do run into it, then you've got an extra little piece of the story that's being told. Does it pay off? I think it does in this case, and I think it's a little simpler than Empires of the Void from an edge case and rules, maybe a little more streamlined, I guess I would say, but probably still a little clunkier than it needs to be, which is going to make the game harder for me to come back to if I come in and play it again in a couple months. I had a great time with it, though, in any case. I'm excited to play it some more.
Great, man. That sounds fantastic. Another Ryan Lockett. Can you compare it to the other two? Is it just like a natural third one? Are the mechanisms much different, or how does it compare?
Yeah, the mechanisms are really different. Again, I didn't play the first one, so the mechanisms don't really feel anything the same, but it has that same story element, and it's got the same, you're in the same world. It's got this quirky kind of fantasy world with robots and anthropomorphic animals and hipster human beings and random characters, which are a blast to look at and interact with. Out of the 4 main characters you can play, they're all slightly asymmetric. One of the characters is a robot cat. And there's a story that you read at the beginning before you start these games, but there's a little sentence written kind of telling you what each of the characters does. And the robot cat one says, giant robot cat trying to protect her young daughter. And I was like, I can't, like, I'm not even sure how that all, happened at all. But I mean, that's the kind of quirky story that you're getting out of here. Really beautifully written little story segments that you get, cool characters you're interacting with, an interesting world. Yeah, I think it's worth exploring. If you don't mind a heavier game, this is not a light game. You're going to go in, sit down with a few friends, and just be laughing around the table. You've got to like reasonably heavy resource management style games, but also enjoy the story segments. And so I don't, there's going to be a cross segment that this is going to fit for. It fits for me really well.
Tim, this reminded me of the one time that you and I played. I think it was Near and Far, and
Yeah,
I remember really enjoying it. It was a fun game. But the thing I remembered most was the artwork in this, which I believe is also by Ryan Lockett.
that's right.
And it's so much fun. I mean, I'm looking now on the BGG page for this at some of the card artwork, and there's these characters like this weird anthropomorphic frog dressed like Indiana Jones and wielding a big spoon. I'm like, I don't know what that is, but I love it. It's so cool. The art in this thing is absolutely delightful.
Going back to our poll question, and Tim, you name dropped a couple times, Empires of the Void 2. That was a game that completely captivated me based on the artwork. My initial impressions of the art there, it's beautiful. If you haven't looked in this game, take a look. The map is fantastic. Planets over here, planets over there. And on the box cover, you've got these just amazing watercolor clouds that Ryan Lockett does. Fantastic.
Agreed. And that's exactly right. You look at this thing, and I don't know, if you're like me, you have to want to explore this world and dig into it. And it's got cool mechanisms to go along with it. There's some very interesting things going on here. Would this be a favorite game if it didn't have all that theme and all that story in it? I don't know. I've had fun exploring the game, but I would suspect that if you didn't put a fun theme on it, it could be pretty dry. Maybe not the most exciting mechanisms, but it all works really well. Tells a cool story, so I like it.
So as you're going through the campaign here, is there little secrets that come out? Are you tearing up cards? Are you adding this, adding that? Take anything out?
There's nothing legacy like here. What it is essentially there's like, I don't know, maybe 10 spots on this big grid map that get seeded with little story tokens. And so you can either play with kind of an arcade mode where you can just reset and always play with these random tokens assorted. So you could just pick up the token and turn it over and get a benefit. There's no story to go along with it. But if you want to play the story mode, there's 6 chapters, and they literally are 6 different books. And so if you land on a space on the map, you're going to open to this spot in book A, for example, on the first story, and read a segment that is related to interacting with your character specifically, but in that location. If I go in and interact with that same spot, I'd get probably something similar. I'd run into some of the same characters and stuff, but it would tell it from my perspective, and I'd have a little bit different interaction because of who my character is. The story is kind of driven by the characters themselves, but I think it's really replayable. It's only 6 chapters, and if you play through this campaign, nothing carries over from game to game. But what does happen is that with each campaign, it adds some new components or mechanisms that are slightly different that you can interact with if you happen to run into them on the board. So like there's this big baggie that I've got of components that will only show up in certain segments of the story. Otherwise, it says if you're not playing with the story, just put them back in the box. So, it really adds to the flavor of the thing. But what's cool about it is that you only have 10 of these exploration tokens. And like, if I'm playing a 2-player game with Steve, maybe we run into 8 of them in the course of a game. And I probably only picked up 3 or 4 of them. So the next time if I play with a different character, I'll never see that same story, and I may not even interact with the same locations. So I think even though there's not things that change during the game, I think you're going to replay this at any point, and you could play through this 6-chapter campaign and get a completely different story and meet different characters and get a lot out of it. So I think there's a lot of replayability here, even though it's only a 6-chapter situation.
So it incentivizes repeated plays to discover new stuff.
I think so, yeah. I think so. I mean, I definitely am open to it. Like, I've played through the first chapter now twice, once on my own and once with Steve. And we didn't run into any of the same situations. So, and we haven't even played with one of the characters. I think 2 of the characters actually at this point. So yeah, there's a lot to dig into here. And then the characters are all slightly asymmetric. Different combat powers they've got. They all have one special power that you can use their mana for. Yeah, there's a lot of game here. I think I'll be playing this one for a long time. And I had a great time playing it solo. Also had a lot of fun playing multiplayer. A lot of race for, the positions on the board and the creatures you're interacting with and stuff like that. So it doesn't feel like a solitaire play, even though you can play it solo pretty nicely. All right, cool. Well, I think that'll wrap up our conversation for what's been on our table this week and probably our episode. So we love interacting with you. If you want to hang out with us, you can find us on Twitter at BG_hot takes. If you hear us talking about Board Game Arena and the plays we've been having out there, you can find our group there, the Board Game Hot Takes group. Join it, and you can start up games. There's a chat in there. You can chat with other people. Just call out a game you want to play. Other people will. You can jump into it. But we'd love to interact with you on there. We've been having a lot of fun playing games with our listeners. If you like the show, rate us and leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts. That will help more people find the show and reminds us that people are listening. So appreciate that if you can get that done. Otherwise, until next week, take care, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye bye.